In the last section, we talked about React as a language and how it forms a bridge between an imperative API and a declarative one. We then talked about JSX, which is a JavaScript extension we can use to write React code with a syntax similar to HTML. In the next few videos, we're going to be talking about React components, the different ways we can define them, some tips about using JSX in components, the benefits we gain by using components like readability and reusability, and how to compose components from other components to isolate responsibilities and concerns. Components are at the heart of any React application. There are two main different types of components, stateless and stateful components. For stateless components, we can use normal JavaScript functions to define them. This is certainly the easiest way to define a simple component, but stateless components have their limitations. We can define stateful components using React.createClass API method. We'll talk about this one briefly, but for the rest of the course, we'll use the more recommended way for defining stateful components, which is to extend the React.Component class. Going back to our simple form node, which has a label and an email input. We're rendering this through Plunker's support for JSX. Let's convert our element here into a React component. All we need to do is create a function. I'll name it form. Note how I used constant here for form because we define the components once and we don't ever change the form constant after that. This new form function will return the JSX we used previously to render the form node. To use this component, we treat it like an HTML element here in render and render it with a self-closing tag. This form is now rendering to the DOM, but now with a stateless function component. Let's define another component. Let's extract the label input elements from here and put them into their own components. We'll call this one email input. Again, just a function that returns the markup that we copied. And we can use this new component as a self-closing tag here in JSX. The form is not rendering to the screen though for an important reason. There is a problem here in these two lines. Remember how these JSX elements get translated into React create element calls? So we can't return two sequential calls here, but instead we can wrap these two elements with a parent element and return that. We can just wrap the markup we have with a div element here, and the form will now render okay. We can use multiple components in the render call here. If we duplicate the email input, for example, it will show in the DOM twice. Let's say we want to also ask the user of this interface about their name too. We can use a new component for that. Call it name input. To define name input, I'm going to copy email input here and change email into name. And this would be a text input. Name is now rendering in the DOM. Next, what if instead of name, we want to split the question into first name and last name? Both first name and last name are simple text input. In fact, if our name input component was generic, we can reuse it to represent first name and last name because they're both string inputs. Let's make it generic. Let's rename it to text input. And we'll make the label header here a dynamic value, something that we can pass to the component element when we use it. For example, let's pass a property here to the first one. Header is first name, and in the second one, header is last name. We just need our text input component to read these header values and use them as the label text. Simple, stateless function components can receive their properties as an argument here. Name it props. Props would be an object that holds all the properties we pass to this component. Right now, it only has one property, header. In JSX, anything inside curly brackets is evaluated as a JavaScript expression. So we can read the header property here as props.header, and our form renders first name, last name, and email now. We used the stateless function syntax for all three components here because they're all stateless, but we can still use the other options to define React components even for stateless components. Let me convert these components here to show you these options, although in an actual project, I'd leave these components as stateless functions. But for the sake of example, let's convert this form component to use React.createClass instead. The form object becomes the return value of the React.createClass call. React.createClass takes a single configuration object on which we can define multiple properties. The only required property is a render function. And in this render function, we return the JSX that we want for this component, which is what we previously returned from the stateless function. The DOM is rendering now through this new syntax. Let's convert the email input to use the other option. We make email input a class that extends React.Component class. And in the class, we define a render function that returns the component JSX. This is currently the recommended way to define stateful React components, and I'm going to be using this syntax in this course when we define stateful components. If we want to convert the text input component into this new syntax, we'll have to do something slightly different because this is a generic component that receives values from its invocation calls. We make text input extends React component. The render method is exactly the same, but it won't render because of props.header here, which does not exist because we don't have an argument anymore. However, when React uses stateful components, it gives them a backing instance that we can reference in the definition using the keyword this. All the properties we pass when we use the components are available using this.props inside the component. The form is now rendering. I'll explain the difference between stateless and stateful components in the next section. For now, just learn the syntax to define both of them.